Chapter 11. Li Chen Matichuk stood in the echoing vehicle bay of his brigade's mothership and tried to look like a serious, sober-minded military man as the first tanks rumbled down the transfer tubes from the heavy-lift cargo shuttles nestled against its side. Despite his best efforts, though, he failed. The gleeful, greedy light in his eyes was that of an adolescent receiving his first grav speeder, and Gerald Osterwald hid his own amusement with considerably more skill than he saw. Brand new Panther medium tanks clanked and clanged across the heavily reinforced deck plates. They wore gleaming coats of tropical camouflage. Their 10-centimeter hellbores cast long, lethal shadows, and the mercenary crew chiefs standing in their hatches were the expressions of men and women who never wanted to wake up as they muttered into comlinks and guided their drivers towards their assigned parking spots. And this wasn't the first freighter with which Matichuk's mothership had made a rendezvous. None of them had worn the livery of any known space line, and their transponder codes had borne no resemblance to whatever codes the Office of Registry might have once issued them. But all of them had been too big, too new and modern for the anonymous tramps they pretended to be. All of Matichuk's people knew that, and none cared. The first freighter had delivered a full complement of 1- and 2-man atmospheric stingers, complete with full service maintenance shop module and at least a year of spares for everything from counter-grav lift fans to multi-barrel autocannons. The next had delivered a full load of ferret armored assault vehicles, the Concordiat's latest light infantry armored fighting vehicle, and the one after that had transferred a full set of rough terrain assault pods to Matichuk's 2 Fafnir-class assault ships. Now the Panthers had arrived, like the old song about the 12 Days of Christmas, and the entire brigade was acting like children in a toy store. But of course, the really big item wouldn't arrive until next week, Osterwald reminded himself, and his smile, if he permitted himself to wear one, would have been most unpleasant at the thought. Matichuk could hardly stand to wait for the Golem 3s, which would be the crown jewels of his new rejuvenated brigade, but then he had no idea what those golems would be. Osterwald and Galcorp's techs had gone to considerable lengths to make sure he would never know either, right up until the moment the carefully hidden files buried in their backup maintenance computers activated, and blew them and anyone aboard their transports with them into an expanding cloud of gas. Osterwald watched the last few Panthers grumble past him and allowed himself a moment of self-congratulations. The Golems would be carried aboard the Fafnirs, which would neatly dispose of that portion of Matichuk's small fleet when Galcor no longer needed it. The mothership demise would be seen to by the file saved in the aircraft maintenance module. The Stinger's small onboard fusion plants would lack the brute destructive power of the Golem's suicide charges. But when they all blew simultaneously, it would be more than suffice to destroy the big ship's structural integrity somewhere in the trackless depths of hyperspace. That would be enough to guarantee that there wouldn't be any wreckage, much less any annoying witness who might turn state's evidence if the Concordiat ever identified Matichuk's marauders as the pirates about to raid Santa Cruz. The final Panther clanked by. He and Matichuk turned to follow along behind it. It was a pity in some ways that the marauders had to go. No one would particularly miss the human flotsam which filled the brigade's ranks, but writing off this much perfectly good hardware would make even a hole in Galcor's quarterly cash flow. Still, the Golems themselves would cost practically nothing given Fregnar government's desperate need for maintenance support, and the raid would probably depress real estate prices on Santa Cruz sufficiently to let Galcor recoup most of its investment in other equipment. Not to mention the fact that we'd no longer need to pay Matichuk the sizable fee in which they'd agreed upon. And as a useful side benefit, Galcor would have its hooks well into the Frignars as well. Once the Concordia discovered the people's government had disposed of golems to a mercenary outfit of dubious reputation, it would become not merely largely but totally dependent upon Galcor's technical support. It was inevitable, since the Concordia would, as surely as oxygen and hydrogen combined to form water, cut off all foreign aid. It was always so nice when loose ends could not only be tied up, but made to yield still more advantage in the process. No one outside of Galcor's innermost circle of board members would ever be allowed to even suspect that this operation had taken place. But the men and women who mattered would know, just as they would know it was Gerald Osterwald who'd engineered it so smoothly. And when it came time for his mother to step down, the board remembered who'd given it Santa Cruz on a platter, and his eyes gleamed at the endless vista of power opening wide before him. "Alright, listen up." Li Chen Matichuk leaned back at the head of the briefing room table and nursed a theatrically battered cup of coffee as he looked around at his assembled staff officers and regimental and battalion commanders. "I take it you've all completed your inventories and inspections? Heads nodded. May I also take it you're pleased with your new equipment? More nods replied, much more enthusiastically, and he grinned. Good, because now it's time to begin planning how we're going to use that equipment against our objective. One or two faces looked a little grim at the prospect of slaughtering unsuspecting Concordiat civilians, yet no one even considered protesting. Not only would second thoughts have been risky, but none of these men or women were the sort to suffer qualms of conscience. Matichuk's marauders had once included officers who would have protested. By now, all of them were either safely dead or long since departed to other, more principled outfits. Osterwald sat at Matichuk's right elbow, surveying the other officers, and was pleased by what he saw, although he was a bit disappointed that none of them seemed the least bit disturbed that he was present. He'd put together a lovely secondary cover to let slip that his present appearance was the result of a temporary biosculpt job if anyone asked, but no one had so much as questioned the Sully pseudonym. No doubt, most of them suspected it was an assumed name, yet they didn't seem to care. In fact, none of the idiots even seemed aware that he ought to conceal his true identity from him. It was just as well, since it also kept them from wondering if he decided to dispose of them all in order to protect himself. Yet their total casual acceptance of his presence was an unflattering indication of their intelligence. It was to be hoped they were better killers than plotters. Of course, the real reason he was to be present today was the informational nuke he had carefully avoided setting off to date. It was about time for the detonation sequence to begin, and he sat back in his chair for several minutes, listening as Matichuk's officers began discussing the assault patterns and deployment plans, and then cleared his throat. Yes, sir. Matichuk turned to him, instantly raising attentive eyebrows, and Osterwald permitted himself an embarrassed smile. Forgive me, General, but as you know, the same ship which delivered your golems to me brought a fresh dispatch from my associates. As I promised, they've been continuing their efforts into securing complete information on Santa Cruz while its audio equipment needs. That information has now been obtained, and well, I'm afraid it isn't as good as we'd hoped. Meaning, Mr. Scully? Meaning, General, that it seems one of these 80-year-old installations on Santa Cruz was a Bolo maintenance depot. In fact, it appears there's a single operable Bolo on the planet. A Bolo? Colonel Granger, Matichuk's senior field commander, she was a hard-bitten woman with eyes like Dura alloy, but her harsh features were slack with shock as she half rose. There's a goddamn Bolo down there? You want us to go up against a friggin' Bolo with a single manned mech brigade? Are you out of your ever-loving mind? Now, General, I told you at the outset that we hadn't yet been able to obtain full information on the planet. But I also told you we want you to succeed, and we do. That's why we provided the golems in the first place, as an insurance policy. Manned vehicles against a Bolo? Colonel Granger's laugh was cold and ugly. The only useful insurance for that scenario would be life insurance, Mr. Scully, and even that would help only our dependents. I understand your dismay, Colonel. Truly, I do. And I apologize profoundly for our delay in obtaining this information, but we do have complete data on the planet now, and I've taken the liberty of loading it into your ship's database, and the Bolo's presence is the only surprise. It's the only well-damn bloody surprise I need, someone else put in, and Matichuk nodded. Sir, I'm sorry to say it, but this changes everything. We can't go up against a Bolo. Even if we won, our casualties would be enormous, and that's no kind of business for a mercenary outfit. I'm afraid canceling this operation is not an option, General. You've taken the equipment we've offered you as the first installment on your fee, and my associates would very much be amiss if you tried to break our agreement. The briefing room was silent once more, and nor can you pretend that this situation totally takes you by surprise. I informed you when you accepted the contract that our data was still partial. If you had a problem with that, you should have said so then. You talk mighty big for a man who's all alone on our ship. I do indeed, but my associates know where I am, ladies and gentlemen. Should anything happen to me, they would be most displeased. And believe the equipment that we've secured for you is an ample indication of the resources with which they might choose to express that displeasure. He smiled, and a strange wild delight filled him as other officers glared at him. Why, he was actually enjoying this. Odd. He never suspected he might be an adrenaline junkie. Still, there's probably time to apply the sugarcoating before someone allowed fear or anger to swamp his judgment, such as it was. Come now, ladies and gentlemen. As I just said, and as I've told you many times before, we want and need this operation to succeed, And it won't if your force is battered to bits in a pitched battle before your search and destroy teams can even go after the locals. My associates haven't been idle, I assure you. The moment they discovered the Bolos' presence, they began formulating a plan to deal with it. Deal with a Bolo? That'd be a pretty neat trick if you could do it. In case you haven't noticed, Mr. Scully, Bolos aren't exactly noted for being easy to deal with. Ah, but their command personnel are another matter, Osterwald said softly, and Granger gave him a sudden sharp, coldly speculative glance. Explain, Matichuk said curtly, and Osterwald folded his hands on the tabletop and settled himself comfortably in his chair. Certainly, General. First, allow me to point out that the Bolo in question is 80 years old. No doubt, it remains a formidable fighting machine, yet it is only a Mark 23. And while your golems are based on the Mark 24, your vehicles may lack psychotronics, but the Bolo's weapons, defensive systems, and circuitry are 80 years out of date. Even if your golems were required to engage it head-on, my associates assure me you would have something like an 80% chance of victory. Someone snorted in his derision, and Osterwald smiled. I agree. It's much easier for people who aren't risking their own hides to pontificate the probable outcome of an engagement with a Bolo. I think if you run the data on a Mark 23B, you may find they're closer to correct than the first impressions might suggest. But the best outcome of all would be for you not to have to fight it at all. Like I say, a neat trick if you can do it, Granger repeated. But her voice was more intent and her eyes more narrow. Colonel Granger, Osterwald reflected, was only one of Matichuk's officers who might have asked the wrong question in the general's place. It was fortunate she was the sort of field commander who habitually left logistics and contract negotiations up to her superiors. Indeed it would, Colonel Granger, and I believe my associates have come up with a very neat answer to the problem. You see, when you assault the planet, the Bolo will be inactive. Inactive? And how do you just plan to pull that off, Mr. Scully? The answer is in your download from my associates, Colonel. I confess, I was a bit surprised by it, but now that I've had a chance to study it, I have complete faith that it will succeed. Do you now? I'm so happy for you. Unfortunately, we're the ones who are going to be sticking our necks out, Granger pointed out coldly. Not alone, Colonel. I anticipated a certain amount of shock on your part, and I don't blame you for it in the least. Obviously, I can't absolutely guarantee that my associate's plan will work, but I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is when I say I believe it will. How? Matichuk asked. By accompanying you on the raid, Osterwald said simply. Someone started to laugh, but Osterwald's raised hand cut off the sound at birth. In order for you to assault the planet, all three of your ships will have to enter Santa Cruz's orbit. And as I'm sure you know, a Bolo, even one that's 80 years old, has an excellent chance of picking off a starship and under those circumstances. True? Heads nodded and he shrugged. Very well then. I will accompany you aboard this very ship to demonstrate my faith in my associates and their plan. If the Bolo gets you, it also gets me. Now, unless you know of something more convincing to demonstrate my sincerity, I suggest we review the aforementioned plan and get along with it ourselves.